Before we do anything else, could we say a big Oregon welcome to Ben Rhodes, please? So thank you for making the trip up.
Oh, no, I'm very happy to be back in Oregon.
Well,
It's
cool.
been too long.
And thank you for joining us for Oregon Humanities Consider This as part of a series, The People and the Public is what we're thinking about and what Ben is going to be helping us think about, especially with a look at the international realm. I want to let you know a little bit about what the structure is tonight, and I want to thank a couple organizations. I want to ask you a couple questions to help Ben get a sense of the room, and then we will dive in. My name's Adam Davis. I'm with Oregon Humanities. We're going to talk for a chunk of time, then we're going to open questions at that microphone over there, which is now in the dark, but later will be in the light. And then Ben will hang around some to talk, and I hope you will also talk with each other. And I also want to say welcome to folks joining us online from all over the place, and especially a group out in La Grande at HQ on the other side of the mountains. Thank you for being here. Quick thanks to the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Standard, the Susan Hammer Fund at Oregon Community Foundation, Pacific West Bank, and especially Lisa Faust. I want to thank the Lyceum Agency for helping us bring Ben here, and I want to put an especial thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Yeah. And then I want to say thank you to many individuals here and there and all over who participate in, lead, support programs that get people talking together about stuff that knits our community tighter. So thank you all for doing that. It means a lot. All right, Ben, these next few questions to folks here to help you get a sense of the room. First, sort of softball. If this is your first Oregon Humanities Consider This, can you make a little noise? If you're a returner, could you make a little noise? Great. I think the returners, we won't judge. If you think of yourself as a participant in the international community, could you make a little noise? Okay, last question, but it's a little more complicated, so I'm going to lay out the two alternative responses before asking you to clap. If when you think about the United States' role in the world, you think first about our safety, that will be the first option to clap. If when you think about the United States' role in the world, you think principally about global justice, that will be the second option to clap. So if you think, when you think about our role in the world, about the safety of the United States as the top goal. Okay, if you think more about global justice, can you make a noise? I don't know. That's the room.
I got it, yeah.
You got it? Okay. Yeah. We'll come back to these questions. The way I want to invite you to start is ask a version of the second question, which is, I guess I want to ask you, can you point to a moment, maybe when you were younger, when you started to feel like, I'm a citizen not just of New York or the United States, but of the world? Like, was there a moment when you started to feel like this is a community, the international community, that I'm a part of?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess I would say, I remember when I was growing up, my parents had friends who were German, and they lived in Brussels. And I met them, a couple of times. They were like our exotic international friends who came to stay with us, and we went to see them a couple of times. And I really liked them, and they were kind of dramatically German. This guy, Peter Karpenstein, used to like to blast Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in the mornings and drink champagne, and take long walks in the forest with his dog, Timmy. He's exactly what you'd want a German to be. And one thing that was interesting is when I studied abroad in university, I went to stay with them. I was 21 years old. And I noticed that, they had a lot of books about the Nazi era. And, I called my mom and I was like, oh, you're having a great time. And I was like, Peter's got a lot of Nazi books, And she said, well, what you don't know about them is that both of their parents were Nazis. And she's like, Peter's father was like an early member of the Nazi Party, and his wife Bridget's father was a significant member of the Nazi Party, to the point that my parents never asked who he was, but and my mother is Jewish, but heard from other people, maybe someday they'll tell you who Bridget's father is, And this was a kind of jarring thing to learn about these people that I saw as these kind of avuncular aunt and uncle types. But then what I realized over the course of a couple days with them is that they chose to live in Brussels. Peter worked for the European Union his whole life. Did not want to return to Germany, not out of any antipathy for Germany. He was kind of very proud German. But what I kind of drew from him in conversation is that he saw as part of his life legacy. His father had literally kind of been in the Gulag and Soviet Union for a few years after the war, had walked somehow a long way back in this dramatic reconciliation with his son. But Peter devoted his whole life to this project of working for these institutions that were meant to prevent the reemergence of the Nazi Party. In America was fundamental to that, and my father had met Peter through one of these civil society organizations that were part of that, like the American Council on German Relations or something, and it was the first time I was kind of truly conscious of the fact that all these institutions that comprise the quote-unquote international community, or used to, are actually made up of human beings who made choices to avoid history, and that the United States was, in a complicated way, not a perfect way, kind of fundamental to that. And I just remember being at 21, when I had no idea I was going to go into this line of work that I did, just very aware of how that was both inspiring but also kind of scary. This is a human endeavor. It's not like a self-executing endeavor.
That is, international work. These are human beings that are doing this stuff.
Human beings decided to build these institutions. Human beings work at these institutions, and human beings could break these institutions. And again, I'm not just saying that in the context that we're meeting here today. I really, truly remember being, open. The world suddenly became a more interesting, more interconnected, and yet also more dangerous place when I kind of the truth of that sunk in.
And so it sounds like that awareness of the fact that it was human beings, some of whom you knew, were taking on the responsibility of shaping that international system, the international institutions. So first there was awareness, but at some point, you became one of those people.
Yes.
Was that deliberate? Did you say, I want to be someone who shapes the global public, who shapes the international realm, or did you happen upon it? And let me just say, the reason I'm asking is because that feels, I think for most of us, quite far away.
Yeah, I did not set out to do that at first. The quick version is I moved back home to New York City after college with every intention of becoming a writer. And I got a master's in fiction writing, which is followed me around in a bad way ever since.
It's loved in this town.
Every single Republican critic of mine has used that, Obama's fiction writer, but so I saw a future for myself living in Brooklyn and smoking pot and writing for magazines and trying to pass a manuscript to an agent and all the rest of that. And I was on that trajectory, and it was fun. I came out here to Portland and hung out. It was great.
Sounds right. Sounds right.
So I had this kind of great, naive, early aughts, life unfolding. But I had an interest in politics, and I was working local politics in New York on September 11th, 2001, which was Election Day. And I was literally handing out flyers in front of a polling station for the city council candidate I was working for in Brooklyn, right on the waterfront. And so I saw the entire 9/11 attacks. I saw the second plane hit. We're standing watching this. I saw the first tower collapse. And I remember walking home that day to Queens, where I lived, and just thinking, sitting in my small apartment writing short stories about men sitting in small apartments writing short stories, suddenly felt like an incredibly trivial thing to be doing with myself. And I just wanted to be involved in foreign policy, whatever that meant. I wanted to be involved in the American response to what I saw. I went to an Army recruiter the next day, which is a funny fork in the road because they had not yet shifted into kind of recruitment gear. So they had no idea what to do with me. They're like, you're at NYU writing fiction. You could learn to be a computer scientist in the military, and so I left without them really kind of getting their hooks in me. And then I ended up in DC. I just wanted to go down there and write and learn about foreign policy, and that led me to getting a job as a speechwriter for a guy named Lee Hamilton who ran a think tank there, the Wilson Center. And then even then I didn't think I was going to be a participant. I wanted to be a writer. But the Bush years kind of radicalized me to want to get involved in politics because I was like, what's the point of writing about this stuff if the people in charge are going to lie to you and ignore, whatever recommendations blue ribbon commissions and think tanks make. And so that I kind of deliberately set out to enter politics. And that's when I went to work for Barack Obama.
Mm-hmm. And there are a few places to go from there. I don't want to leave what sounded funny, which was the idea of, being in a small room typing about a guy in a small room typing. But in both of your books, you refer a couple times to windowless rooms, that you talk about being in windowless rooms on multiple occasions. And as I was reading and thinking about the work you were doing with President Obama, in a way, you have a window into the international world that a very small number of people have. And so somehow I was thinking about what you must have seen and continue to see, probably from a different perspective. But so when you just talked about 9/11, I think I want to put the question of your particular window along with the question of events or phenomena that seem to have done most to shape the international situation as you see it. And maybe following what Viktor Orban did in an early speech, maybe you could give us 3 phenomena over the past couple decades that you think are the most important things we should think about or understand when we think about the current state of the international situation.
It's a great question. And so I'll try to answer it briefly because I could go on about any one of them. I think 9/11 is one. I think there was a period from the end of the Cold War to 9/11 when America felt like it had kind of escaped history. And I don't just mean the lazy take that they're writing books about the end of history. Mm-hmm. I just mean it just seemed like we could assume that the world that we were living in was going to continue to be like it was for an indefinite period of time, and the United States position was going to be what it was for an indefinite period of time, and then 9/11 happened, and to me that was like the giant shock to the American system that you don't get to step out of history. That, frankly, in ways that Americans still don't want to reconcile, that was to some extent blowback for the role that the United States played. Doesn't justify it, but we can't sit in our country and think that we can do whatever we want around the world and not have people get pissed off at us and try to hurt us. And so there's a whole story that flows out of 9/11, which we can talk about, but about the kind of securitization of how America approached the world. Everybody would have clapped for the safety answer to your questions. But that kind of led to the creation of a, multi-trillion-dollar enterprise of a national security state, of a Department of Homeland Security, of multiple wars, and also the kind of creation of a new form of American nationalism. If you watched, Fox News in the years after 9/11, that was a kind of jingoism that actually I don't remember from the 90s. Like there's suddenly their flags on the screen and they're enemies, and there's a kind of martial nationalism, right? That I think led ultimately to Trump, and we can talk about why that is. The second event that, the Iraq War, you can either slot it, let's put the Iraq War under that umbrella, because I think that was a profoundly consequential event, because that was the event in which a lot of the rest of the world was like, okay, we kind of trusted these guys, they're in the front seat and they have the car keys, and we all kind of trust them to just drive. And now it's like, where are these guys taking the car? It doesn't seem like maybe they're drunk. Like, why is this happening? And so I think the kind of implicit trust that that superpower status relies on was starting to fray. Second event, fundamental event to understanding everything, I think, that we're living through today is the financial crisis. Because the basic premise of globalization was you're going to lose something of your identity, right? Global culture is going to be a bit more homogeneous. There's going to be more movement of people, more movement of ideas. Traditional identities are going to kind of be encroached upon. But the bargain was you're going to get your standard of living is going to keep getting better, and these forces that seem beyond your control, trade, free movement of peoples, kind of globalism itself, the bargain is, it's going to be good for not just the people at the top, but working classes, and that was erased with the financial crisis. And as bad as the financial crisis was in this country, it was worse almost everywhere else, because because there was just less cushion, right? And so Orban, and I wrote about him a lot in this book, who's a kind of obviously a flavor of Trump in Hungary, just very astutely sensed that the populist backlash to the financial crisis will not inevitably come from the left. It could actually come from the right. Because I could basically say, I'm going to embrace the oldest form of politics there is, which is kind of national tribal identity politics. And I'm going to connect that to a critique of an establishment of globalization that people are really angry at. But instead of my answer being kind of Bernie Sanders economics, my answer is going to be we have to return to a traditional sense of national identity. And the them to the us is the immigrants and the globalists and the liberal elites and the Muslims and it kind of this right wing, the fact that the backlash to the financial crisis and kind of the failure of globalization was captured by the right, I think has done a lot to shape global politics since. And all 8 years in Obama, I could feel us kind of running in the opposite direction or swimming in the opposite direction of the currents, And then very quickly, the last one, and I'm deliberately kind of predating even Obama, because I think we've been living through the aftermath of these structural forces. I'd say the 2008 Beijing Olympics, because that was an event in which China which had been kind of biding its time and kind of drafting behind the United States to develop their economy, shifting towards this kind of state-controlled capitalism out of communism, embracing technology. All of a sudden, they're like, here we are. Like, we can put on a better opening ceremonies than any of you people. We're rich, we're powerful, we're not gonna stay in the shadows anymore, and we have an entirely different system. And if you're in the developing world, if you're in the global south, you're like, well, wait a second, maybe the Americans don't have the only model. And frankly, Americans are kind of jerks to us. And we could be like these people instead. Or we can shop around and we can work with the Americans on some things and the Chinese on others. And so those three things were obviously hugely destabilizing to the world I came of age in the 90s, because they rattled American confidence and created American nationalism, upended the assumptions of globalization, and created competitors to the United States, which puts us into a period of both political instability in our own country, but also global instability and conflict. And now we are living through one of those times that we thought we're past, we're in the past, but here we are.
Thank you for that really cogent response to a probably unanswerable question, and thank you also for the surprising, to me, number 3. And that's really helpful to think about.
Do you remember that opening ceremonies?
I do.
They created the weather, right? They had dragons in the sky, and it was cool.
And any list, it was cool.
Yeah.
It was cool, but it sounds to me like in all 3 of those that in a way some of what's happening is perception of a threat which might have been less detectable before. And so I want to ask a question about the idea of threats and the international system. A question about whether the way, as you were working on national security, were you sorting between friends and enemies? Is there another country that can be considered simply a friend, or is it all threats?
Oh, I'm a fairly unconventional person to have been, a deputy national security advisor for 8 years, so I acknowledge that. And so I thought less in those terms probably than other people did. I guess as I saw the world in those days, they're definitely friends. I mean, and it's very striking. When you're in government, there are kind of 3 kinds of countries, if I had to generalize, right? There's if we met with the British, the meeting wasn't about trying to find agreement. The meeting was, hey, we all agree on what we're trying to do everywhere, like what's the play we're running, And that was roughly the same with most European countries and, a handful of other countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the countries that are, fully under the American security umbrella, because a lot of muscle movements and habits have been generated over time to have pretty similar views about most geopolitical. There may be some trade tension that you have to smooth over, but you're starting from a place of agreement. Then there are countries that are that you have a relationship with where there's things you're working together on, there are things you disagree on, there are things that they want the United States to be doing, and you're trying to figure out whether you can do it. And that's, a lot of the medium-sized Latin American, Asian, and African nations. Whether it's a South Africa or Colombia or an Indonesia, right? In there you could feel the legacy of the non-aligned movement, where it's like, well, they're happy to work with us on certain things, but they're gonna really kick us around on other things. But they also want to work with us on things like health and education and things that actually benefit people. And then Russia, is an adversary, and every meeting is basically you're going through a list of things where you don't agree, and you're just trying to either manage that or be confrontational or try to find some opening to do something. Where I've changed over time as in my worldview is that what's interesting is I spent 8 years looking at power from the ultimate inside-out place, from in the Situation Room in the Oval Office or out the window of a motorcade or inside some other government building. I went on every single foreign trip Obama took as president. I've spent 8 years working really hard to reprogram myself to look at power from the outside in and to travel widely and meet with people who are in civil society or they're journalists or they're entrepreneurs. And I have entree to a bunch of networks, including through the Obama Foundation that works with people like that. And what I've come to see is that it's not countries that interest me as much as people. And that there are people in countries that are friends of ours that I disagree with, and people in countries that are adversaries of ours that I am very like-minded with. And I think, not that I've figured everything out, but I think that's kind of what's missing, that capacity to kind of not oversimplify things, but to try to find solidarity with people who are like-minded about certain things in different places and build from that.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say that everything you've said so far has me thinking about like 12 different directions to go. So thank you for that. And as I'm sorting through those, when you talked about, for example, a difficult meeting with your Russian counterparts and trying to figure out what you want to get out of it, I think I want to ask you a question about how clear you had to be around goals in the international system, sort of like the very oversimplified question about safety or justice that people responded to very much on the justice side, which I imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, I imagine that the role of anyone in government is really to focus first on the safety side. Like, what were your top goals when you were going into meetings with Sergei Lavrov?
Yeah, well, if you take the Russians in particular, I mean, because my own goals in the Obama years, were varied, which is worth, maybe we can come back to that. But, when it works, so in the first Obama term, you had a leader in Dmitry Medvedev, who's since become completely off the rails, but that's another story. But he saw a pathway to Russian kind of prestige. A lot of Russian psychology is just about wanting to have the stature of a great power. He saw that pathway as connected to working with Americans, and kind of being in the room with Barack Obama and making deals. And so we did a whole range of things in that first Russian, that only Medvedev administration. An example I'd give of like a goal that is in safety and justice space, right, is that we negotiated a nuclear arms treaty, the New START treaty, which was conventional, cut significantly nuclear weapons, and have the ability to monitor each other's nuclear weapons stockpiles, and inherently that is in our safety interest. But importantly, what we try to do with that is say, hey, we're doing this because it's in service of the more global effort to reduce the spread of nuclear weapons, right? The core of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which most people don't think a lot about, is that the countries with nuclear weapons agree to give up their nuclear weapons. And they may not do it overnight, but we want to see them working in that direction. And then that's the basis under which you can tell all the other countries who don't have nuclear weapons, and you can't have them, Mm-hmm. And so actually the New START treaty was a part of our strategy with Iran, because it was like, well, we're strengthening not just, this isn't, this is back in the days when there were norms, we're strengthening a norm so that we can go to other countries and say, let's kind of pressure the Iranians to make an agreement to not develop their nuclear weapons. And Medvedev brought that mentality to a lot of things, even though we couldn't get to yes on everything with him. what was interesting is when Putin came back to power, to put a human element on it, we had heard rumblings that Medvedev wanted to stick around in the presidency, and I think those were true. But ultimately, Putin, yanked the rug out from under him and said, "I'm coming back." And I'll never forget, like, the first G8 summit, because Russia used to be in the G8, that's now the G7. The first one after Putin was elected, Putin didn't show up, which is, typical Putin, and was kind of a message. And Medvedev showed up, and the first night, it was at Camp David, and there's actually a bar at Camp David. And so I went to the bar, having a drink, and the Russians show up, and they ordered all the vodka in the bar, and just took it with them. And the next morning, I'm walking by the Russian cabin, and like literally at back, there's just like bottles and bottles of vodka. There's like cigarette butts everywhere. And the point is that these Medvedev people, this is their last turn on the global stage, and had just gotten completely trashed. And then at the G8 itself, Medvedev was watching like a European soccer game on his iPad the whole time. He's checked out. But the point is, what they knew is what was coming. Because when Putin came back, he had no interest in what I just described. Mm-hmm. It was like, I'm coming back. I'm just not going to work with you guys on anything. And you're just going to have to adjust to a reality in which there's no more arms control, there's no more global cooperation. And it just shifted very quickly. And the interesting thing I learned, later, but I got to know a lot of people. I got to know Alexei Navalny. And I remember talking to Alexei Navalny's chief of staff, and he's like, I was there with the Medvedev people the night that we saw the announcement on television that Putin was going to run again. And they were like, they had planned for the second term. They were talking to reformers like this guy who ended up being Navalny's chief of staff. And it was just like one of those pivot points in history, And so while Russia, the country, has its own interests and the human element, right? Like sometimes there's a Vladimir Putin, and that just changes what you can do in the room,
Mm-hmm. So, in a way, that last comment you just made, sometimes there's Vladimir Putin and you need to respond to that. And what you said about norms a moment ago, I want to keep both of those out, but I also, when you talked about Medvedev watching European soccer, like sometimes it feels like for me, and I think for many people I know, that's about as close as we're going to get to the international system, is watching a Premier League soccer game. And so when you are talking about being at Camp David with the folks that we read about in the news, it can feel like this world out there that's very distant from even the public world that many of us find ourselves in all the time. So the question I want to ask is, how do most of us, if at all, bring what we have to bear on that world?
At the end of the day, these people, they all wake up and get dressed in the morning, right? They're just like us, these politicians, these political leaders, even these strongmen. And they ultimately are responsive to public opinion in their countries and the world. And if you doubt that, then just consider the amount of effort that is made every day in all parts of the world to make you think that you have no agency in the world. Like it's a design, it is, and it stretches across social media, politics, money in politics, business, but ultimately, all these things are a reflection of where societies are going. And from that very big general answer, I just say, There are things that, are beyond our control. Like I can't end the war in Ukraine, or the war in Gaza. But a lot of issues actually play out much closer to the ground. If you're interested in a country or an issue or a cause, it's actually much easier to get involved than you think. You find I got interested in unexploded ordnance in Laos, and I got involved in a small NGO that has managed through advocacy on a budget that's probably the same as the Oregon Humanities Council to, at least until a couple days ago,
Ordnance,
generate
unexploded.
hundreds of millions of dollars in funding to clean up unexploded bombs in Laos that, children might otherwise have picked up and been blown up by. And that's a small example, but the point is that there's macro politics and get involved in politics and vote and organize and all of that. But actually internationally, there's all kinds of ways to say, I care, and what I do is focus. Like, you're not gonna solve like a Rubik's Cube or a game of Risk the world, but if there's one or two or three things you care about, usually there are ways to kind of feel connected to that, to get involved, or frankly, just understanding the world that you're living in, I think is an act of resistance and of affirmation, because a lot of effort is made to make you not understand the world, And I think the ultimate international community is just people figuring it out for themselves in the spaces where they live, and then acting in ways that will affect the culture over time. And I think the clearest manifestation of that has been on the American right for the last 15 years, where there's been a lot of civil society and organization and solidarity with like-minded, right-wing or far-right parties around the world. Look at what they did. So yeah, there's more ways than you think to kind of plug in.
Thank you. That, again, really provocative and helpful response. Understanding. You just made it sound like understanding alone has value. And as I was reading your books and reading the paper and thinking about our country and other countries, like these days it's very hard for me to understand my own country. I think I used to think I understood it some. Now I don't think I understand it barely at all. And that's the country that speaks my language, that I've grown up in. And then how much confidence when you were going from place to place did you have that you understood enough about what was going on in these different countries to develop policies, to, in some cases, put lives at risk? Like, how much did you have to understand? How confident could you be about understanding other countries and cultures?
I mean, you were right to start with that humility. I mean, the U.S. government, first of all, has a massive amount of resources that are designed to help you understand. From like a very capable diplomatic corps to aid workers to intelligence reporting. But there's a couple of things that are interesting here that I highlight, which is, I remember when I had to write a speech that President Obama gave in Cairo that was meant to kind of reach Muslim audiences around the world. I got all this input from the U.S. government, and it was all about like terrorism and, security and all the safety stuff, right? And so I'd just been on a political campaign for 2 years, so I said, do we have any polling about what those people actually want to work with the United States on? And they kind of didn't, but they could go assemble polling, and so they did that. And if you looked at what every country in the Muslim majority world wanted from the United States, where did they want to work with the United States? It was basically the same 5 issues, maybe in a different order. It was education, science and technological cooperation, entrepreneurship and kind of learning how to build businesses. Guess was not on the list. Terrorism, nuclear weapons. And I remember thinking, like, we spend all our time talking to these people about things that they are not interested in hearing about from us. And it's the most basic form of politics that you don't do that, you know? And guess who doesn't show up and talk to them about that? China. I mentioned the Olympic ceremony. They're looking at that. They're like, well, these guys, you know, we may not like their totalitarian streak, but they're showing up here, and guess what the Chinese are talking about in Africa? They're talking about infrastructure, health, education, science and technology, you know? And so the one point is, I tried to train myself to at least understand what people wanted from us. In terms of understanding those countries, I would try to do it. And Obama, as a speechwriter for Obama, I had an interesting perspective because the national security guy that I was, you're not wired to try to understand the countries. You're just there to advance American interests. And if you can find a guy who's smart about that country to help you do that, that's great. But as a speechwriter for Barack Obama, who wanted to connect with people, I would have to kind of, start a habit of talking to people from those countries, people in civil society or just contacts or writers from those countries. And I would try to gather those perspectives to inform what Obama would say in places. And, kind of cheat sheet, is there a novel I can read that, is reflective of the identity of, but, you're not going to get to know a place entirely well. But you know what? You are going to be smarter because you're going to know what to avoid, and you're going to know what the grievances are. And if I have a criticism of the entire enterprise that I was a part of, to shorthand it quickly, in the last 8 years, I've gotten to know a lot of Afghans. I just have like a kind of an Afghan diaspora friend group, mainly in London, but it's scattered around the world, tragically, since the collapse of Kabul. And it got me really thinking hard about the fact that I was in hundreds of meetings in the White House situation about Afghanistan. Military strategies in Afghanistan, economic strategies in Afghanistan, development strategies in Afghanistan, and there was never a single Afghan in the room. And, that's why you get the result that we got, And Americans do this time and again. And, the further you get, to also name another uncomfortable truth, the further you get from Europe, i.e. the further you get from other white people, the less America understands the mentality and worldview and interests and grievances and intellectual origins of places. And if you look at American foreign policy since World War II, the further you get from Europe, the less successful American foreign policy tends to be.
So there's something about the argument that you're making there that is like beautifully harmonious, which is that the more we understand other cultures, the more likely it is that we will achieve our interests.
Yeah, I truly believe that. Yeah, and it's a radical idea in American foreign policy.
And not just in American foreign policy, I would say in much of foreign policy, to think that understanding the other and achieving our interests are neatly so. Say a little more about that.
I think that there's something about power that makes people feel like they have less reason to understand the interests, right? And so it's actually not the case that if you're a small or even medium-sized country, you can't assume that you can do what you want in another country. You have to really get to know that place if you want to make a deal with those people, or if you want to have a hope of influencing a larger country. So, interestingly, it tends to be the US and now China and Russia that put in the least amount of time trying to understand, power does corrupt in the sense that it makes you feel immune from having to think through what you're doing. You would think that Russians would understand Ukrainians better than maybe anybody else outside of Russia, given the proximity. But clearly they didn't understand Ukrainians because they clearly thought that war would last a matter of days. And so I think power blinds people to that kind of examination. If you think of another country as another human being, you wouldn't think that the best way to achieve your objectives is to just tell that other human being exactly what you're going to do and expect them to be completely okay with it. You'd want to get to know that person, and so think of countries like people, because that's what they are, and we just don't. Obama is imperfect, obviously, and I'm not here to suggest everything that is right, but I do think that he was unique as an American president in that because he was black, and so he'd been inherently on the other end of power in this country, because he'd lived in Indonesia as a boy, which is a country where the CIA just sponsored a coup that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths. He kind of had an intuitive understanding of, this is not, the world doesn't see America like we see the movie of ourselves, And actually, good presidents have had that capacity too in the past. We have not had that recently. In both parties.
So you just said, think of countries like people, which took me back to Plato. And when they're looking for justice, in the Republic, they start off looking in one soul. Then they say it's too small. Yep. Let's look somewhere bigger. We'll look in a city. And it's this weird jump. And also, while you were talking about power, I was thinking Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War and the Melian dialogue, especially where they say, the Athenians come to Milos and say, we can talk all we want about what's right, but we have more power than you. So that kind of conversation doesn't affect what's actually going on here. And I say that to say, if countries are like people, it depends what we think people are like or countries are like. What's your read on human nature? What's your read on how nations interact? And should we assume that nations want primarily to understand each other or to compete as a version of what is the international system even more cutthroat than it might be between people because it's agglomerations of people and getting back to national identity and borders?
Yeah, if you think about countries like people, the overuse of power works really well until it doesn't. What's amazing about human beings is their complete incapacity to learn that lesson. The nerdiest thing I'm doing right now is it has a Portland angle. I have a couple friends from Reed College, and we're reading War and Peace together, which was an idea of the Reed College cohort, because one of these guys is a Russian professor of Russian literature, right? So it's cool. I'd never read this book before, but there's a great scene in it where it's all about the role of the individual in history, right? And there's a scene where Napoleon is at the decisive battle outside Moscow. He's never lost. He's undefeated. He's the world champion, And he's eating lunch, and the battle's starting to turn. And Tolstoy describes this scene in Napoleon's head where he's giving the same orders to the same runners who are taking the orders to the same generals, and those orders always worked in the same results. He could finish lunch and they'd win, and all of a sudden it wasn't working anymore, because he'd gone too far. And if you just look at the cycles of history, if you start to ignore the interests of other countries, if you start to think that you have impunity from any kind of international, let's not even say a law, gravity, if you assume that people are not going to band together to resist the way in which you're overusing or abusing power, everybody's learned that lesson. The Athenians learned it, the Romans learned, well, let's just take the West, but I could apply it elsewhere, The Athenians learned it, the Romans learned it, the British learned it, and we're learning it right now. And we are acting in a very obvious late-stage empire way that we think is remarkable, but it is the most obvious fucking thing that you don't need to have read 1 million books to know that this is what it looks like when an empire is collapsing because of its own pathologies, right? So that's the bad thing to do. I think that the whole challenge of international community is to have a mindset. The short end a foreign policy person would give is, that there's an enlightened self-interest whereby by binding our own power and constraining our own power, we can trade that for a more stable world and more shared benefit. I think to take it into a less wonky place, though, it's also that capacity to look at other human beings who are different from us and find that interesting instead of threatening. So to tie together to your previous question, I fundamentally, and I'll just, I wade into dangerous waters here too, I have friends who they'll look at the Palestinians in Gaza and all they see is Hamas. Whether it's like a 3-year-old kid or a 65-year-old woman or a 25-year-old, or particularly a 25-year-old man who may or may not have anything to do with Hamas. And in addition to that being, I think, a narrow mindset, it's actually a sad one because those are interesting people. Talk to them. And you guess what you'll figure out? They're exactly the same as you are. They just live in a different place and look different. That's my experience globally, is that we have a lot, everybody's pretty similar with a lot of different culture layered on top of them, but that's what makes it interesting. Wouldn't you like to meet the people that eat somewhat different food and listen to different music and have different heroes and different myths? That should be a good thing. And I want to live in a world where that's a good thing and not something to be scared of.
And as towards the end of that comment, you talked about the world you wanted to live in, which of course points back to the title of your memoir, The World as It Is, which is different from the world as it ought to be. The title of your more recent book, After the Fall, and even the name of the podcast you work on, Pod Save the World, which is it's a jokey title, but there's nothing jokey about the verb save. And as I was thinking about those 3 titles and the tenor of your books and the work you've done, there's like a spiritual and moral yearning in it, which feels very unusual to see in the international arena.
Yeah, I had to kind of deliberately make a journey the last 8 years, away from a certain way of thinking that I had been wired to think. I had to kind of truly relinquish. I'm not trying to get too, we're in Oregon, so I can do this. I had to not just relinquish power, but I had to kind of not want it anymore. So I did not self-censor how I talked about certain things, because maybe 8 years from now it'll be read back to me at a confirmation hearing, and I have to not worry about. I'm not Pete Hegseth. I guess I could just. Is this vodka? If it was, it'd be interesting. But I had to be willing to have people who were friends be annoyed, if not mad at me, about what I was saying on my podcast. And I don't say it's a virtue signal because I'm the one who benefited. It was I don't want to be suffocated by the machinery that I came out of 8 years ago. I want to explore what it's like to be in the world in different ways. And I guess, one thing I would say to people who are probably feeling, like I am, is, okay, it's not great. And to take it very seriously, there are people much more vulnerable than me who we need to be very concerned about. At the same time, to your point about spiritualism, and you don't get to choose the times that you live in. It would be really nice to live in a time where I always felt like the government reflected who I was, where I didn't have to worry about some of these things. But looked at from another way, hey, like, we're in it, you know? We're in the 30s. We're in the teens. We're in the 1870s. Like, we are in a period that matters. And whatever you believe in, we are in a period that matters for a reason. And if we all just check out and tune out, we know how those periods end. And also, and this is where I'll differ from kind of where people were in the first Trump term, it's not going to be as simple as like, get out there, therefore, and organize and try to win the next election. I actually think it's deeper than that. It's like, how can we regenerate within ourselves and our own communities a shared sense of belonging? What does it mean to be an American? What does that even mean anymore? I think I could have answered that question easier in 1990 than I could today. To your point about not, because the people on the right have thought about this a lot. You know, like Viktor Orban was defeated as Prime Minister of Hungary. He was a fairly conventional center-right Prime Minister, and he was defeated in 2002. And he spent 8 years doing what were called civic circles, where basically in rooms like this, but often around churches, they had small meetings and they talked about Hungarian identity and they talked about historical grievance. And by the time he reemerged, he had this kind of spiritual message about, you know, making Hungary great again. And we all kind of need to do this work of thinking about why are we here, you know? And it's not enough to wish somebody else won an election. You have to kind of think about, well, why do I want that person to win the election? Or what kind of person would I like to see who's not running for office? And so, I don't know, I think we have to be asking the bigger questions now.
Okay. I have one last question before we open questions over here. I think just one, and it's related to what you just said. It's also related to what you said before about wanting to talk to people and that we're all the same. And I want to ask that question about the nation we're in, that you said it was easier to answer the question in 1990 than it is now. But one of the stories we tell ourselves and declare in public regularly is that this is an exceptional nation, that there's something unusual about us. You have a window and had a window into the world that many of us don't have. You've seen many countries, you've interacted with many people running many countries. Do you feel like we're an exceptional nation, or are we one nation like all other nations?
We are exceptional in the sense that we're not like anyone else, you know. And I think they're in this, you know, we're weirdly large and diverse, and people came from everywhere to be here, and so, you know, we weren't founded in a fixed ethnicity or religion, you know, even though some people thought we were. But to shorthand it, I'd say that in my experience in politics, there are kind of two narratives of American exceptionalism. And one is that, like, we're just exceptional, you know. What America does is kind of inherently right because we're America. We're a city on a hill. You know, we're the heirs of the Greeks and the Romans. You know, we are, you know, the Rome of today. And if we do something wrong, it's still right because we did it, you know. And I know I'm short-ending it, but I actually think that's what a lot of people believe, you know, that there's something kind of inherently just in our actions. And if there's an occasional Vietnam or Iraq, like, well, you know, better that we're out there in the world doing this stuff, you know, because we're America. And I come out of a political tradition that sees American exceptionalism as our capacity to fix what is wrong with America. And, you know, obviously Obama was a president who came out of the civil rights movement, which came out of the abolition and justice movements of the 19th century. This argument goes all the way back to the founding fathers, right? You know, who's American and who gets to decide, Are we essentially that room where the Constitution was written, which was a bunch of white male property owners? Or are we all the movements ever since that have just tried really hard to let more people be American, have the full rights of Americans, whether they be black, whether they be women, whether they be immigrants? Obama would talk about this internationally, and it was interesting. Then I wrote all these speeches, and the Republicans said he was on an apology tour. And what used to drive me nuts about that is that he never actually said sorry. He said, America had all these problems, but what makes America great is our capacity to steadily try to fix them, And so I actually thought what was being cast as this kind of un-American message, I thought was this patriotic message, And so you have this kind of duality of exceptionalism. Is our exceptionalism our capacity to change, or is our exceptionalism something in our past that we have to recapture, make America great again, And it's that kind of dueling exceptionalism that we've never resolved, and kind of speaks to the profound conflicts around identity that we're dealing with today. And not the silly ones, but at core, we're living through like a pretty profound wrestling with what that is. Because we are about to become a majority non-white nation, and that may not happen anymore, right? Given the current administration, I mean that's a practical manifestation of this question of what is American, who gets to decide. But then when you travel around the world, I think you also come to see, every nation is exceptional and has their own narrative, and with its own wellsprings and its own currents and its own debates. And frankly, what makes America more interesting to me is that all those wellsprings and currents have fed into us, because people have come here from all those places. And so actually, at the end, what I find makes us the most interesting is that we just have people from everywhere here, which is now not a trendy thing to think. But giving that up, if refusing to see that as the unbelievable advantage that it is part of the problem that we're dealing with now. But I do think, again, we have to understand that, why would anybody in another country want to just subscribe to the first version? You guys get to play by different rules. And the last thing I'll say about this, and I know we're going on, but what you have to understand about foreign policy is the most important thing about American foreign policy is what is happening in America. It's not some genius, the reason we won the Cold War is not because like Ronald Reagan, gave a speech and said tear down this wall or spend a bunch of money on defense. It's that more people on the other side of the wall wanted to live like we did. That's why we won the Cold War. It was what was happening here. And I remember talking to Alexei Navalny at one point, and he's like, I don't need you guys to save me. I don't need some mix of sanctions and speeches and pressure. But if the better example you guys set for how democracy can look, the better it is for me. The worse example you set, the worse it is for me. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, my whole life I've actually been making only one argument, which is that in a democracy that is not corrupt, better people tend to rise to the top. And he's like, and again, I apologize to people who will disagree with this perspective. And honestly, this is Alexei Navalny's, not mine. But he's like, when Trump gets elected, then Putin can just say, look, they're just the same as us. That's not the best person for the job, right? And that's because of corruption. And I think Americans, this gets all the way back to your point about what can people do? What can people do? What we look like here is what the world takes from us, more than our sanctions and our military. And so what are we modeling as the most powerful country in the cultural superpower and military superpower? What we're modeling is seen everywhere. We're the only country that every other country kind of follows what happens here in a way that, not everybody follows what happens in Beijing or Moscow or certainly not in Johannesburg or in Rio. And so think about that, because people are watching. And what are they seeing?
So as we transition to questions, Can we say an initial preliminary big thanks to Ben? Thank you. Thank you. So I imagine there will be a number of questions, so I just want to ask if you can say your name, try to keep your question a question and fairly brief, and we'll give Ben a chance to get to as many as possible, and we may intersperse a couple questions from LeGrand and elsewhere as well. Thank you.
We'll start with a question from LeGrand. As a former exchange student, how could encouraging cross-cultural experiences among youth impact our understanding of our own nation and others?
Oh, it's a great question, and I'll try to give short answers so we can get to all these questions. I think that, again, to carry forward the people analogy, and people in the public, right? You can understand yourself better when you see yourself through somebody else's eyes. Think about your own family. If you're in a family with some dysfunction, and I'm not saying I am, and you know, but sometimes you have to step outside of your family to see, like, oh yeah, that's kind of weird how we all act at the dinner table, you know, and exchange and cross-cultural exchange. You know, when I met an Afghan and had her explain to me what the Afghan war looked like from her perspective, I understood myself a lot better, you know. But the benefit in it is just simply, I just say, gut into somebody else's shoes and look at yourself and look at this country from that perspective, good and bad. I'm not trying to be negative, because there's things people love about America that I take for granted until I hear that from somebody else. And so that's the main thing, is just that capacity to stand in someone else's shoes and see yourself from the outside in.
Thanks.
Hi, Tracy Simmons. We're not even 2 weeks into the new administration, and the president is the most unserious person. Like, he's talking about the Gulf of America and Greenland and tariff wars with our allies. My question is, with losing this much status on the global stage, how do we ever redeem that as our country, as a country that has integrity and care for others? Like, what does that look like to you?
Thanks.
Yeah, I think that, again, to try to give short answers here, but to me it means that we are, I mean, to take a home example, we're in need of a complete rebuild, not a renovation. You know, in the sense that, like, Trump comes in, he's kind of like, you know, Trump light, it's like MAGA light, because there really were all these kind of guardrails. People who worked for him didn't, you know, really support what he's doing, and, you know, a lot of people stood up to him. And then, you know, Biden comes in, and the kind of whole premise was, and I'm not being wholly negative, because it was understandable premise. Hey, we're just going to go back to being, you know, we'll just keep doing things the way that they seem to be working before, and that will get us past this. And it clearly didn't, you know. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But the point is that there's no going back to something. You know, he is going to tear it down. He is going to break, to some extent, the federal government. He's going to break alliance relationships. Let's hope that people, not too many people, are hurt in the process. But the point is that, and this is why I made the point about not just winning one election, like, we have to be thinking about not like what we want to restore or return to, but like this is like a hurricane coming through, like, how are we going to rebuild out of this? How do we want America to not just kind of, let's go back to leading the rules-based order? No, there's that's gone. And that America's never coming back. And that order's never coming back. So what should come next? And maybe that's not the worst thing, because America is not the same country that built those institutions in the 40s and 50s or the 90s. And so the opportunity in this, which, you know, I don't want to minimize the dangers, is to I don't mind that the Democrats are not, that visible. Take a minute, like give some thought to don't mouth the old, I don't want to hear about, Wall Street, Main Street, middle out, whatever, consultant speak, bullshit. Like, what do we stand for? And not just Democrats, obviously, independents, Republicans. Like, what should America be in the world? Because it should be different. It's going to have to be different than it was before. And that's, I don't have the answer. But you know what? Like, we all have to acknowledge that. Like, I have some ideas, but let's start by saying, let's be curious about figuring that out together.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
My name is Mark Meininger from Portland, Oregon, and this is sort of a compound question. Earlier in your talk, you were talking about even autocrats, say, are vulnerable to peaceful, broad-based opposition to them. So the first question is, what's the mechanism that makes an autocrat vulnerable to widespread, peaceful opposition? The other part relates to just what you were saying about rethinking what it means to be American and what America could be. And the part of that question is, do some of us have to figure that out first before we are in peaceful opposition, or can it be in parallel or in some other sequence? Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I'd say, look, autocrats there are political movements, political protests, political assembly, political speech that matters. But also, there are cultural and socio and economic factors that autocrats are mindful of. If you look at the Chinese Communist Party, it's interesting. They broke no dissent. But there became a point, they had this zero-tolerance COVID policy that was incredibly draconian and incredibly intrusive, and people had huge limitations. And at a certain point, like a lot of people in China were just like pissed off about that. And these were not political dissidents, but they started to kind of bitch about it on platforms, and some people started protesting. And there was a mood in that country that the Chinese Communist Party changed their COVID policies in like a week, and it was like on a dime. And that was not something that they had planned to do, So the first point is that yes, you want vanguard activists, and you need them. But there's a broader sense of public opinion. I mean, Trump last time, when he was separating children from their families, there was this kind of upwelling of people being like, I don't like that, and he backed down. Now this time around, he's plowed the ground probably for there to be less of that. But the point is, people, it's actually often not the protests in the street. It's that kind of mood that can shift over time. And that kind of relates to the second question, which is I've been working on a book project for a while that's required me to look at the kind of interaction between kind of movements, political and social movements, and then politicians. And what you constantly find in American history is that there is a movement that has to start to redefine what America is, what it means to be American. And then there's a person that comes along and kind of captures it. To take the Trump example, Trump is impossible without the movement of, the Tea Party and all the work even before that to build a kind of right-wing civil society and energy, and there's a lot to that. But then the charismatic figure comes along, and there's an army that's already been built, and so I think that we need to remember that. It's not just organizers waiting around to be led. It's organizers and people in communities kind of and building movements and making changes and waiting for the moment where, look, the pendulum's going to swing back. It always does in this country. It swings back and forth. And there'll be another person, and it doesn't have to be Michelle Obama. Like it shouldn't be. It should be someone that we're not thinking of, right? But it's that interplay between civil society and culture that will then make the next politician better. And that's what we need.
Thanks.
I think you said something like, in history, every country that has overused its power has seen how that ends badly. And so I wonder, as someone who has spent so much time in the Oval Office and the Situation Room and on foreign trips, and in light of, just to take an example, what the government of our country did this week to the government of Colombia, do you see an alternative? Should we be hoping for an alternative? And what should the people in this room do to promote that alternative? I'm Alex Schaefer from Portland, Oregon.
Oh yeah, no, thanks, Alex. That's a great example in the sense that, Trump threatens Colombia, which is really actually our probably most reliable partner over the decades in South America, with all these tariffs, and humiliates them for what? So that instead of civilian planes flying back, people being deported, they're now military planes. So in our kind of weird funhouse mirror politics, it's like this huge win for Trump, but it's literally just means there are different planes landing there, And in the process, he humiliated an entire country that has options. Like the Chinese, they featured a lot in this conversation, but they're much more active in Latin America in building infrastructure and ports, and they're trying to expand trading relationships. So, by the way, are plenty of other countries. So are European countries, and so I think what will happen is, not overnight, but over time, a country like Colombia, will look in other directions for trade because they don't want to be vulnerable like this. And so you'll start to see, I think, the Latin American countries banding together more closely. You'll start to see China having more influence there and more of a trading natural resource relationship. You'll see, the Europeans doing the same. And we'll look up in 4 years, which is not a news cycle. And so it's not like there's going to be like a winners and losers of the week, but like the world will have changed, and that's already been happening, but it will accelerate. And I mean, what can people do about it? I think part of it is culturally we have to kind of stop. I've been in politics for 20 years, and it's gotten like just stupider over time. I mean, part of what we need to be is just not that interested in this kind of strongman, game that Trump plays. Like, part of it is just denying him the attention of, like, wow, he really like humiliated the president of Colombia, and look at his Truth Social about it, and part of it is, I think, and obviously part of it is like politics, but another part of it is, people that have, I mean, quite literally, if you have any interaction with Colombians, like, I'm sorry, no, but I mean this, like, I have a lot of European friends who work in transatlantic relations, and I keep reminding them, like, your relationship with America is not just with the U.S. government. It's with businesses, it's with universities, it's with cultural institutions, it's with culture itself. So you may not even ever meet a Colombian, but you might write something or create something or do something that they're going to see, right? And just being a little bit more mindful about the fact that the relationship between America and the world should not be defined by a president or even just the government. How does the citizenry enter into that relationship?
So we will try to get all questions from everyone that's there, but we might have to hustle a little, so I just say that.
I'll be very quick, yeah.
My name is Jennifer Walter. I spent 23 years in DC practicing law, and I was at 15th and New York Avenue, so I kept an eye on the White House. And then I came back to Oregon and taught public school.
So it all went to hell after you left, apparently. Yeah. After you stopped keeping an eye on us.
I was doing student teaching during 9/11, so that was an interesting time. Anyway, I taught government, among other subjects. And I want to go back to where we started the evening with the question. And I understand why you posed the question this way. It was like, do you want safety or do you want global justice? Yeah. And my thought was, that's an asshole question. And this question is, what is wrong with America? And so I thought about how I would do this in government, because the question was posed with a Venn diagram like this. And so, Mr. Rhodes, my question for you is, and if you were in my government class, and there are 2 teenage boys and no whiteboard, I'd make you make circles and then show how much do you believe those 2 things overlap. So we don't have a whiteboard, and I'm going to ask you, within 1 percentage point, how much do you think those 2 overlap?
Thank you for the kind question.
Look, I'm somebody that believes that, justice is, a world of justice is a safer world. I'll never forget, so I negotiated the normalization of relations with Cuba. And we've had this insane policy towards Cuba for 60 years where we just punish the hell out of these people and expect them to embrace democracy. And so my whole premise of this was, like, let's end that policy, open things up, and let the Cubans figure it out, and actually that will inherently be a safer, better thing. And I remember the last week of the Obama administration, I was in Havana and I had dinner with Raul Castro, and we drank a lot. We had like many bottles of rum. I don't know how I managed to do this, but, and he was telling all these stories. He's a Castro, he talks a lot, and even more than me. And he said, when I raised Trump, he said, Ben, he's like, there was once a Russian general here from Ossetia who had the ability to launch nuclear weapons from Cuba without even telling us. That would have led to the destruction of this island. So I've dealt with worse things than Trump, And I was like, I wanted to ask him something the whole night. And so I was like, at the end of the night, I was like, I have one question for you. And I don't know how many of you have followed the history of Cuba, but basically the revolution happens against a totally corrupt US-backed government. Fidel comes in with Che and Raul, and they're young, and they do some pretty bad things too. They start killing their enemies. But it's still TBD where this is all going. And Fidel comes up to the U.S. and kind of gets stiff-armed, by the Eisenhower administration. And then obviously Kennedy comes in and does the Bay of Pigs. And so at the end of the dinner, I was like, I just want to ask you, were you guys all communists who wanted to be in the Soviet bloc, or did we kind of, and before I could finish the question, and I believe him. I mean, I'm sure the hardliners will think this is naive Ben Rhodes, but he was pretty drunk. And he looks at me and he pounds on the table and he says, it was you. You gave us no option. We had nowhere to go but the Soviets. There was nobody else who would trade with us. There was nobody else who would give us. And I believe that. And oftentimes we do things in the name of safety that make us less safe. And because by pushing them in the arms of Soviets, we got nuclear weapons in Cuba, And so look, my circle is very overlapping. It's not entirely. I might be wrong to some extent because the world is a kind of a tough place too, and people do horrible things to each other, and there's something to the fact that you can't assume good intentions in everybody. You can't, and there are going to be bad people that come along and try to do bad things, and so that circle, my circle, may be too aligned, but But I'm telling you, it's definitely more aligned than, sorry, the question. And that's what is, but you know, you're right to ask it because it actually surfaced this dynamic, right? That
was the goal.
And
That was what I was after.
I've been in politics. So I just think I overlap them, 80%. You could move it by degrees, but we do have to get back. I mean, all I'll say is Gaza. Like, that's not safe. That's not going to be safe for Israel or the United States.
And as we go to these last few questions, let's try to make them neither asshole questions nor long questions. Thank you.
I'll try, I swear. Tanvi, and for context, I'm an Indian international student in US. I feel like since 9/11 until now, the hate for South Asian and as well as like Middle Eastern immigrants has increased overall, just because of the way we look. And no administration so far has been able to exacerbate this problem that the hate crimes against these people today are like high. Like, my parents are scared to send me to this country because every other day an Indian student in US is dying. And no administration, in my opinion, has done enough. So do you see any hopes for these kind of people in the US, especially given that the Constitution, the people are given the right to have the American dream and probably have like a future to live and do something as humans?
Yeah. I agree with you that not every administration has done nearly enough. I'd like to think we tried more, but the short answer is, well, first of all, it's also not all bad. America's a very strange country because simultaneously, you're right, people are profiled, treated negatively, stigmatized, but also some people are, making huge impacts. Who are in immigrant communities from those places. I think that the negative version of the story is tied to 9/11. I wrote a piece for the New York Times recently about Hegseth. It was basically about when to follow the power overreach thread of the discussion. When a superpower fails to win wars, they increasingly turn to enemies within. So if you were consuming right-wing media the last 20 years, it started, we're going to go off and conquer, the Middle East and win great victories. And when that didn't happen, is when you started to see the lens turn inward. And suddenly we're mad at the people who are here, who are brown or from South Asia, or they're Muslim, or then the border becomes a fixation. To me, it's a very logical thing if you study history that you lose a war, or don't win a war at least, and you start looking for enemies within. And I think the way to build back from that, which is again a common thread of the conversation, is beginning in communities themselves. I don't think this kind of broken brain thing that you would see in certain parts of our politics and media is going to change soon, but communities can have different attitudes towards immigrants. Universities can have different attitudes towards students. Frankly, universities can choose to not be bullied by, Pete Hegseth and, the anti-woke, whatever brigades, and be welcoming, because in the end, it's much better. I have a lot of friends who are South Asian and Middle Eastern, and my life is a lot better for it. It's self-interested. Like, meet some new people, guys. Try some new things. Like, it's kind of boring just, sitting around with a bunch of white people talking to each other in this country.
Hi, my name is Peter, originally from Chicago. I'm a student at Reed. There's like 5 of us here. So in your answer to the question about the 3 most important events in recent history, while you were talking about Orban and the rise of right-wing populism, you mentioned this idea of feeling like you were swimming against a current during your 8 years working at the Obama administration. My question is, I often also feel like a lot of the things that are going on in our world today were set in motion by things that I had no control over.
Yeah.
I wasn't born when 9/11 happened, wasn't alive when the Iraq War started. I think I was 3 in 2008. My question is just, to what extent are we victims of history, and to what extent are the thoughts of the people in our communities dictated by these events that we don't have
Great
control
question.
over?
How old are you?
19.
19. So, I love that question. And by the way, that's the whole point of War and Peace. So, if you have time to read a 1,300-page Russian novel, like the answers are better than I could. But I'd add one more. A thing I didn't put in the answer is when I wrote that book After the Fall, and I always fail to like encourage people to pick up the book, but I think they're for sale out there. He asked me, okay, this is like pretty dark because it's about like the rise of authoritarianism, and he's like, but I want to ask you what's different now, because there's always been a contest between democracy and authoritarianism. Why is now different? Like, think about that. And one of the first answer that popped in my head was technology and social media, and how that has allowed the mass dissemination of misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theory, and talk about a force beyond your control. Like the algorithm is, we're being, shaped by these technologies and kind of reprogrammed as a species by them. And if you're 19, you've got climate change and you've got technology and AI. But what I would say is, two things. One, when I was 19, it was, I'm revealing my increasingly later middle age. But when I was 19, it was, 1997. Man, think of what's happened since then. The point is, like, things are gonna change. Like, a lot is gonna happen in the next 20 years. It's totally unpredictable. If things can swing the ways they have before, they can swing back too. And you have to remember that, we keep thinking everything is permanent and inevitable, or all is lost, or all is won, and it's much, everything is more fluid than that. And then my second piece of advice to you is, if there is something that is trying to make you think that you don't have control, that's the thing that you should ignore. So a social media platform that is trying to just feed you a steady diet of some information, don't do that. Like, seek out other information. Fossil fuel companies that want to make you think it's impossible to actually get rid of fossil fuels and deal with climate change, like that, yes, that's not his personal choice, but that's not the case. Like, politicians who, there's a lot of forces that are designed to make you feel like the individual doesn't have agency in history, but it does, because it did for them. Like, look at how much Trump has changed things. That was an individual in history, surfing the backs of a lot of other individuals. And so it's just that core sense of just think about your own, seriously, like everybody, think about your own interaction on a day-to-day basis with power. It's much more constant than you think it is. Every time you look at your phone, you're interacting with power, And think of ways to kind of take control of your own thinking. If you read, Orwell, that's, I will not allow them to, well, it doesn't end well in that book, so maybe. But what he's getting at is that like the space you need to wall off is your own perspective of the history. Because you may not get to decide history, but you get to decide how you live in history.
Thank you.
Jacob Cardozo with Pacific's Politics Club and Criminal Justice Club. In your examples of the United States and Putin, you highlighted a global split in ideology between liberal idealists and realists. How do you navigate such a split in ideology when interacting with other countries with differing ideologies in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of what's interesting now is that ideologies are actually seemingly less important in a way. Like, Russia is not communist anymore. Like, they're not at the vanguard of a Marxist global revolution. They're just a big country that is nationalist and has interests, and they kind of create an ideology to support nationalism. We do the same thing in this country to some extent. But I think what I found when the Cubans, when I was negotiating with the Cubans, we sat down in the first session, and I was meeting with Alejandro Castro, who's Fidel's nephew, Raul's son. And, those people have ideology, and they believe it, some of them. In the first, 4 hours, I started, he went, we want to talk to each other, it's great, we're meeting. And then I got a 3-hour lecture about history, and we went back to the Bay of Pigs invasion and attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro and shut down Cuban airliners and lots of stuff, you know. And I remember it got to me, and normally a U.S. person would be like, well, here are all the shitty things you guys have done, and there are plenty that they've done. And I was just like, you know, I'm not really interested in talking about those things. I was like, I know they're really important to you, though, but I'm here to kind of look forward and blah, blah. I gave kind of, you know, pablum. But then we broke for lunch, and I was like, what are these guys? I was like, baseball, like Cuban, you know, and so we started talking about baseball, and they were super into baseball. And then Hemingway, well, he lived in Cuba. We talked about Hemingway. And then, you know, we talked about, like, my negotiating partner is a big fisherman. I'm not. But they started talking about fishing. And then I was looking, I kind of had this moment where I could pull back the camera, and it's like 5 people sitting around like a bad collection of sandwiches and like, you know, warm coffee. And it was just like a bunch of human beings talking to each other. And so I think if you're confronted with someone who has a very different ideology, you just have to find some human lifeline to grab onto and try to build out from that to expand common ground. Because you're not going to be able to, they're never going to agree with me on ideology. But maybe from that space, we could find some overlapping interests, human interests, that could be the basis for some agreement.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, I'm Max Ushinsky. I'm a freshman poli-sci major at Reed College. So you mentioned that America is following the same actions as crumbling empires of the past. Do you think that the decline of American empire is inevitable? If not, what might reverse or postpone that trend? And if it is, how will America have to adapt to that loss of status?
I think it's a great question. Reed College is great. Although I was telling my best friend in the world went to Reed, and this is just a great Reed story. Like, his commencement speaker was a Reed alum who was like a playwright. And he gets up, I was telling the story to some of the Lyceum people earlier. The first line of his commencement speech was, "Life is an ocean of pain." And then he proceeded to talk about his divorce for like 20 minutes. And then I said to my friend, I was like, well, how did the Reed audience take it? And they're like, oh, people loved it. People were like, this is like a radically interesting speech, you know? Look, I'll say we are dealing with it poorly. I mean, we've been on, you know, I think the height of the curve for us was kind of like the early 90s, the end of the Cold War, and particularly since the Iraq War and the financial crisis, like, part of why you get Trump is it's a nation sensing a loss of status. And that's a very ripe time for a strong man to come along and say, we shouldn't lose status. And I'm gonna go, I mean, it's very telling. Who's he picking on? You know, Panama, Colombia, Greenland. It's like a bully going out on the schoolyard being like, you know what? I've lost some status because I was embarrassed. So I'm gonna find some small people to go beat up, you know, and that's kind of what's happening, right? But at the same time, importantly, America's not gonna go away though, and America's gonna always, for at least for the lifetime of anybody in this room, absent a complete collapse of American society, which is not totally out of the realm, but we're going to be a big, powerful country with huge influence in the world and a military superpower and an economic power and a cultural power. And we have to get comfortable with that being enough, with not being able to tell everybody what to do and not being able to kind of pick the governments of smaller countries. Like, look at when we get in trouble. It's when we try to kind of engineer Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, anywhere in the Middle East, really. We just have to let go a little bit, you know, and be okay with that. And I think that's what people are having a hard time with. But it's kind of, you know, we have to psychologically adjust to being in an international community that we aren't necessarily the captain of, but we are important in it. And that's apparently going to take some time.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Kai Markle. I wanted to ask you a question that I've struggled with a little bit and just thought about a lot, which is why do people listen to us as a country? Is it because we have these advanced forms of government and fair elections and things like that? Or is it because we can like bomb them and destroy their culture? Or is it both? I mean,
It's all of the above, and it's a really important question. It's a great question to end on because, look, a lot of people listen to us because they have to, because whether they like it or they don't, like stuff we do is going to matter in their lives. We could bomb their country, or their cousin wants to study here, or their undocumented cousin lives here and sends remittances home, or they have a trading relationship with us and terrorists would affect them, or there are very practical reasons why people follow what happens in America. But I will tell you, as someone who's felt the tug of cynicism a lot over the years, I interact with a lot of people in global activism, civil society, a lot. I'm in various organizations that have kind of young leaders or young participants in places as different as Uganda and the Philippines and Hong Kong and Eastern Europe and wherever. And I've never been anywhere where someone didn't point to something about America that they found motivating, because it's still a pretty radical notion that there's some capacity for social mobility, or that there might be minority figures who can rise to the top of politics or culture or athletics or whatever the thing is. And actually, like, sometimes people in other parts of the world are more capable of seeing how complicated America is than we are. We really are not just like what a simplistic view of American history to just look at the 47 presidents and think that's American history. That leaves out the interesting parts. And if you think about, I'll end on the note of like, if you think about what people like the absolute most about America, it tends to be culture, right? Music, sports, movies, and all of that culture tends to be the blended America, right? And sometimes it's like expropriation, but whatever you want to think of rock and roll being or hip hop, like it couldn't have emerged out of anywhere other than the kind of weird mix of people that live in America, And people around the world see that, and it has a kind of powerful psychological grip. And actually, the reason people get so disappointed when America does things that they don't like is because they really want to believe that America is like the better version of this blended identity, And so again, like, our capacity to figure that out here is more important than any foreign policy that we have as it relates to the future of the world. Because when America is able, for the book I'm working on now, I just spent a lot of time with the civil rights movement. And, what's amazing about that is, you pick the apex of that, maybe being King and the March on Washington. You've got this guy in his 30s, mid-30s, speaking in front of the Lincoln Memorial to 250,000 multiracial people after performances by Bob Dylan and Joan Baez, not Timmy Chalamet, Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, but also, Mahalia Jackson and gospel singers, and, Paul Newman's there, and Harry Belafonte, and it's everything that the world wants America to be, and so one way to think about these identity issues is to kind of step back and be like, well, what do I love about American identity and culture? Because we've lost a lot of uniculture, right? We were chatting backstage and we did the American thing. We talked about, sports, right? But that's like the last vestige of shared culture in this country. You know, we don't watch the same TV anymore. We don't like, but we have to kind of think about, well, what do I like, you know, in our history? What do I like in our culture? And how do I build out from that in trying to reconstruct an American identity that makes sense to me?
Thank you for the question. As we close, 3 very quick things. First, the way you talk about culture and the everyday and talking to other people, I just want to say, like, this is what Oregon Humanities is trying to work on around the state with lots and lots of community conversations and getting people hearing each other's stories. I hope you will check out the work that's happening if you haven't yet, so please look into Oregon Humanities for that. I want to thank you for being here, for your good questions, for joining us in different formats. I hope you'll talk to each other a bit before you get out of here. And I just want to say a very large thanks, Ben, for the way you connect what can feel like a rarefied world with the world most of us live in, and the way you connect the political and the moral, and all that you've given us to think of with what you do and how you talk about it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well said.